And now to introduce Chuck. Charles Marohn, known as Chuck to friends and colleagues, is the founder and president of Strong Towns and the author of Strong Towns, a bottom-up revolution to rebuild American prosperity. If you haven't read it, you should. He is a professional engineer licensed in the state of Minnesota and a land use planner with 2 decades of experience. He holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering and a master's of urban and regional planning, both from the University of Minnesota. Marohn is also author of a world-class transportation system. He hosts the Strong Towns podcast and is primary writer for Strong Towns web content. He has presented Strong Towns concepts in hundreds of cities and towns across North America. He's featured in documentary film Owned, A Tale of Two Americans, and was named one of the most 10 influential urbanists of all time by Planetism. Chuck grew up on a small farm in central Minnesota, the oldest of 3 sons of 2 elementary school teachers. He joined the Minnesota National Guard on his 17th birthday during his junior year of high school and served for 9 years. In addition to being passionate about building a stronger America, he loves playing music, is an obsessive reader, and religiously follows his favorite team, the Minnesota Twins. So happy to have you here, Chuck. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here, and I'm sorry, like a lot of you, that we can't be together in person. There's a lot of friendly faces that I see here, people that I know and have enjoyed being with. I would have enjoyed that a lot, but I'm grateful that we can do it this way. And thank you for the invitation. We are going to, and I'm gonna flip over to this here. We're gonna talk a little bit off the bat here about complexity, and really, I think this is kind of one of the more important conversations right now. Just when we look out at America today, we're in an election year, and things always get crazy in election year. And I think, good politicians or good political discourse tends to simplify things down to, 1 or 2 adages. Recently, 4 years ago, build that wall was, kind of a short synopsis. I want to go the opposite direction. I want to introduce some complexity into our conversation and our dialogue. For those of you that don't know Strong Towns, we're a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to support a model of development that allows our cities, towns, and neighborhoods to become financially strong and resilient. I'll give you our website at the end. We produce media, so we produce 2-3 articles of content every day. We have a very active social media presence, and we do everything we can to try to share our message with as many people as we can, so that we can see change in the world. When we think about complexity, I want you to start by thinking about a rainforest. We all understand intuitively that a rainforest is made up of many different flora and fauna. They all have their own unique characteristics and properties. They all interact with each other, and they all act independently of each other. So they're all able to respond to stresses and opportunities independently. When we look at a rainforest, we say that the properties of a rainforest are emergent. They emerge out of this complex interaction of many different things. It's not ordered. It's not, directed. The properties of it emerge from all these complex interactions. When we look at a rainforest, we grasp that this is a complex adaptive system. Yet, it's important for us to realize how human habitat has historically had these same properties. Individual actors are able to do things independently. They interact and feed in with each other. The properties of these places tend to emerge out of this complex web of interactions. This is a complex adaptive system as much as a rainforest is. We contrast complex systems with systems that are merely complicated. A Rube Goldberg machine is very complicated. In fact, the complicated nature of it is part of the novelty of it. When we look at a Rube Goldberg machine, there's all kinds of things going on, but we understand that if we cut one of these ropes or moved one of these blocks, the machine wouldn't adapt and change. It would just die. It would just stop working. your automobile engine is a very complicated machine, but we understand that if you stressed your automobile engine beyond its limits, it's not going to adapt and become a toaster or a wash machine. It just breaks at becoming an engine. This is the fundamental difference between systems that are complex and systems that are merely complicated. When we look at complex systems, we understand in a rainforest that if we were to give a rainforest, too much sun or too much rain in any given amount of time, it would adapt and evolve. New flora and fauna would benefit from that. They would start to emerge and take over. Things would change, but the system wouldn't fail. It wouldn't collapse. If we look at something that is merely complicated, like a cornfield, we understand that if we give a cornfield too much rain, too much sun in any given year, it's not going to evolve and become soybeans. It's just going to fail at being corn. Complicated systems have a pass-fail kind of dynamic. When we go to human habitat, we see the same kind of thing. When we look at complex communities, places that largely for the conversation we're going to have today, you can think of as being built prior to the Great Depression. These places have emergent phenomena. Give them stress, give them opportunity. They will react, they will evolve, they will change, they will grow. But when we look at systems that are merely complicated, what we see is that they do not have the capacity to react. In fact, our modern development pattern is designed specifically to not adapt, to not change. One of its selling points is that it will remain static indefinitely into the future. This, of course, from a biological, from a human habitat standpoint, is an impossibility. When we go back and we look at how human habitat is formed and created, some photos from my hometown here in central Minnesota are illuminating. This is Brainerd, Minnesota, back in 1870. I live a little more than 2 hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul today. This is what the very first iteration of it would have looked like. This is what the very first iteration of all of your cities would have looked like as well. Every city that was built prior to this great experiment we've been on since the early to mid 20th century began like this. A series of pop-up shacks, some hopes and some dreams about the future, a very modest investment. If you look at these places, understand that we built thousands of similar places all across North America. And for a variety of complex reasons that defy our ability to predict, to project, or even to fully grasp after the fact, a lot of these places failed. When they failed, what happened? Well, not much. This was not a very big investment. There's not very much on the line here. The people would salvage what they can. They would move on to the next place. But we built thousands of these across the continent, and for a variety of complex reasons. Again, reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even to fully understand after the fact. A lot of these places were successful. And when they were successful, they would start to grow the way that all complex systems grow. They would grow incrementally. In this case, incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense. And so as more and more people would move to this place, more and more of these little pop-up shacks would go up. The place would become actually more of a place. The underlying land values would start to increase while the buildings themselves would start to go into decline. That combination, rising land values and declining building values, would create a natural redevelopment pressure. And over 30 years, this street would evolve to become this street here. This is essentially from the same spot the last photo was taken. This is in 1904. Again, what you're looking at is a complex adaptive system. If we were to go out a couple blocks off of this street, we would expect to find buildings in this style of intensity, in this scale. This is growing, you can think of like a culture in a petri dish. And as more and more people would move to this place, as more and more people would come here and be part of this ecosystem, it essentially would put more fuel into this complex adaptive system. Property values would go up, redevelopment would naturally occur, and you would see these 2- and 3-story wood structures over time becoming buildings of brick and granite. Again, the exact same street, this in the mid-1940s. This is the way that all of our cities grew prior to the Great Depression and World War II. This switch where we made our cities from complex adaptive systems into systems that were merely complicated. Of course, we've had over 75 years of doing this. This exact same street now looks like this today. It's a couple blocks here outside my office. And what you have is a wasteland of parking lots and half-occupied buildings. I like to point out, because it crystallizes what has happened. There's $500,000 of public infrastructure in this little stretch of street right here. When you add up the asphalt, the aggregate, the concrete, the pipe, all the stuff that is done to drain water, you've got $500,000. Where is the wealth that will sustain that public investment generation after generation after generation? It used to be there, and it had to be there, because in order for a complex adaptive system, in order for human habitat to survive, it must be able to, in a sense, sustain itself. That is gone now. We're going to talk a little bit about what happened. I want to have you think about why we made this shift. A lot of forces came together in the early 20th century. We often ascribe the automobile as the big shift, but I don't find that very convincing. You can go around the world and look at other civilizations that have the automobile, and while they do often have American style of development, they don't all have American style development, and they certainly have not done what we did, which was to transform an entire continent around a new experiment in a very short period of time. I think it's important to understand this generation and what their motivations were. My grandfather was a Marine in World War II. He was actually one of the first, he was the first group into Nagasaki after they dropped the atomic bomb. And, he would tell me about living in the Great Depression. He lived with neighbors. He was not able to live in his home. He wound up living with neighbors. They allowed him to stay in the barn, and they would feed him. And in exchange, he would work the farm. I remember once he told me, and I'm telling you this about my grandfather because he was not a wimp in any way, but he told me, without FDR, he would have been dead. That seems like hyperbole to me, but I'm not going to second guess the man. He did many extraordinary things in his life. And, this was the most formative period of time in his life. If you look at the Great Depression, the one thing that is clear about it, hang on one sec, is that nobody really knew at the time, and we even don't have agreement today on what caused it. There were all kinds of theories. There's all kinds of ideas. Even today, you can read economists that will explain, here's what caused the Great Depression. And you'll read that and you'll be like, wow, that's very compelling. And then you'll read another economist and they'll say something the opposite. Here's what caused the Great Depression. You're like, wow, that's very compelling too. We do not have an agreement on what caused this. I think more importantly, we had no consensus on what to do. I have something tickling my throat, so hang on. Sorry about that. So we didn't know how to get out. Wow, I've never had that like deep of a tickle in my throat where I literally don't feel like I can talk. Hang on. All right, better. Not only did we not understand what caused the Great Depression, but we didn't understand how to get out of it. If you look at the New Deal project, the entire New Deal project was, in a sense, an attempt to try many, many different things to see what would work. Let's try this, let's try that. You have this whole long list of programs. No one really got how to fix this. They were just trying everything they could to see if we can get the economy going again. The one thing that got us out of the Depression, in the sense that unemployment went down and economic growth went up, was of course World War II. But it's hard to call World War II prosperity. We took a whole millions of working age people, sent them overseas to kill and to die, And we took millions of other people and put them into industry, drafting, and creating the implements of war, the ships, the planes, the munitions. When the war was winding down, when it was clear that we were going to win the war, it was just a matter of time. The economists, particularly economists advising the president, started to freak out. This is actually a quote on your screen from Paul Samuelson, one of Roosevelt's senior economic advisors. Were the war to end suddenly, there would be ushered in the greatest period of unemployment and industrial dislocation any economy has ever faced. What they knew and they understood was that nothing had changed about our economy. If we were just going to bring all those troops back home, shut down those war industries, there was nothing stopping us from going right back into depression. Of course, that's not what happened. And we all understand, because we can look back at history and see that that's not what happened. What happened is we took all of that industrial might, we took all of that capacity, and we redirected it into building a new version of America. We took a population united against common enemies, one that had lived through depression and war together. We had a vision for what we could do to reshape and reimagine our cities and our landscape. And we put Americans back to work building this new version of what the US could become. We all understand it as, suburbanization, the post-war economic boom. We look back at this period of time with great nostalgia. And we do this because, in a sense, it worked. It got people moving again. It created jobs. It created growth. It built a middle class. We still nostalgize this period of time as this kind of golden age of America, because, even for the people that were left behind and not included in this project, we still kind of, I think from a, elite standpoint felt, well, it will eventually get to them. We'll create enough prosperity. Well, it will work for everyone. I want to go through what was going on here, because what we did is we took a system of city building that was complex and adaptive. And in order to achieve certain economic and social ends, we made it into something merely complicated. We created what we call at Strong Towns a growth machine. And we've been living with this growth machine ever since. Here is Fresno, California. And I choose Fresno because we have great maps. If we had good maps of my hometown, I would use that. But these are some very compelling maps. You'll see your places in here because really this is the story of North American cities. Here's the boundaries of Fresno, California in 1897. Watch the complex adaptive system evolve over time. You can see up until we get to the end of World War II, you have a pattern of development that is that incrementally growing up, incrementally growing out, incrementally becoming more intense. You're seeing that complex adaptive system at work. Now the kinetic growth machine kicks in. Now we are, as a national macro objective, using this style of growth and development to create jobs, to create economic growth, to really drive our economy and drive prosperity. And we all know what this story looks like. Here's Fresno in 1970. Now we're in 1983. We cross over into the new century, and we see a massive, massive horizontal expansion. My little town of Brainerd, Minnesota is 13,500 people back at the end of World War II. Today, my little hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota is 13,500 people. We have not grown in population at all. Our area has grown by 10 times. If you think about that, there are some serious ramifications. Obviously, we can create growth through this pattern very, very quickly. And you see right now Congress, discussing how do we get the economy moving again? Well, we need a $1 trillion infrastructure bill. No. We need $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill. The more money we can pump into building new stuff, the more jobs we can create, the more economic growth will happen. Yet when we look at our cities, a different story starts to emerge. This is data from Lafayette, Louisiana. At the end of World War II, you had a population a little over 33,000. Today, we're 3.5 times that amount. So an enormous amount of growth in the post-war period. Yet when we go back to the end of World War II, we see In Lafayette, it took 5 feet of pipe per person to provide water to the people of Lafayette. Today, it takes 50 feet of pipe per person. That's a 10 times increase. If we look at something like fire protection, at the end of World War II, it took 2.4 hydrants per 1,000 people to provide fire protection. Today, it takes 21 times that. So we can grow very, very quickly in this system. We can create lots and lots of growth, lots of jobs, lots of short-term gain. In Lafayette, we can grow our population by 3.5 times. Yet to do that, our cities, our communities are required to grow their liabilities by 10 times, 20 times. We might be able to make this trade-off if we were becoming richer, if we were becoming more prosperous, if we looked at our communities and we saw that our wealth was growing commensurately. Yet when we step back and we say, okay, in Lafayette, you grew your population 3.5 times, but you grew your liabilities by 10 times and 20 times. How about the wealth of the community? And what we see is that the wealth just doesn't keep up. Median household income has grown by only 1.6 times during this period of time. When we look at Lafayette, we see what we see in cities all over North America. Families are saving less. They are taking on more debt. They have lower net incomes for the most part. The middle class is stagnating, and we are struggling under this weight of decades and decades and decades of accumulated liabilities and promises that we simply don't have the wealth to sustain. I want to give you a graphic example of why this has happened and what is actually going on in our communities. One of the costs of changing from a system that is complex to one that is merely complicated. Focus on these 2 blocks. These again are right outside my office building here in the downtown. I recently moved. I know my friend John is on. I was over in the rail yard right here. I'm now in the middle school that is a block this way over here. It's the middle school where I met my wife actually back in junior high. So I am sitting in the counselor's office right now, which I've turned into my studio. So it's kind of a cool experience to be here. So outside my door is these 3 blocks. This was part of the North Brainerd addition. Essentially the first expansion of my hometown back in the early 1900s. These blocks were all developed in the 1920s. You had, and I'm gonna show you what they look like here today. That block on the left, we call the old and blighted block. Essentially, if you think back to those pop-up shacks I showed you from 1870, this was the 1920s version of that. So while the center of town was, creating these 2- and 3-story wood structures, the new stuff, the new building, the place where literally like poor entrepreneurs would go to get a startup, right, get a place, was out here on the edge of town. These were the pop-up shacks. Had things continued as they had for thousands of years, you would have expected, 2- and 3-story buildings to emerge, things to start to become more wealthy, more prosperous. Of course, that's not what happened. These 3 blocks were built in this style of what you see on the left. We had the Great Depression then, we had World War II, and now we have this new style of development that just skips right over these blocks and starts building out on the edge. These 3 blocks have stagnated for almost 100 years now. And the city labeled it blight, tried to get them torn down, is still trying to get them torn down, was able to get the block on the right that I've highlighted there torn down. And now we have the new Taco John's drive-through. Taco John's is your standard fast food place. When they came in, they met every standard that we had, every requirement that we had in our codes. And so when you look at this checklist we've created of the kinetic growth machine, they were able to check every single box. They met all the setbacks. They met the floor area ratios. They had the right sign. They had the right amount of parking. They had ADA accessible bathrooms. They had sprinkler systems. The environmental people in town were able to convince them to put native plants in the stormwater area back here. The bike walk advocates were able to talk them into putting in a sidewalk. The sidewalk ends right there, but they got that little stretch in. They were, of course, able to get financing. They were able to get insurance. All of this stuff meets all of our codes from the very local level all the way up through, secondary market standards for commercial development property. This is exactly what our system delivers over and over again. Complicated, yes, but very, very simple to deliver. Here's the implication for the city. That block on the left today has a value of $1.1 million. When we add up the value of all of those properties and all the land underneath them, what we get is $1.1 million. That block on the right, it is the same size, it is the same area, it has the same amount of public infrastructure, it essentially has the same cost to the community to provide service and maintenance. It's only valued at $618,000. Understand what you're looking at. You're looking at the traditional development pattern, the complex adaptive way that we build our cities over thousands and thousands of years, the idea of starting small and incrementally building that up over time. You're looking at that in its infant phase after almost a century of decline and neglect, and it still financially outperforms the stuff we build brand new today. And everybody on this call knows the future of the taco place, right? We know that, in 2 decades, that Taco John's will be a used car lot. There'll be a new Taco John's up the road. Their financing will have been paid off and they'll move on to a new place. A decade later, it will be boarded up. We'll be trying to get some type of subsidy to get it torn down and redeveloped. We've all been around long enough to see this happen. I show this one because it's a very compelling story, but I want you to know that this is the story of America. This is what we have systematically done across an entire continent. We've denuded cities. We've actually devalued systematically cities where we've made massive investments in infrastructure, massive investments in community. We've denuded that return. Well, at the same time, we have added scores and scores and scores of other investments that are even less productive than what we see in the middle of our cities. This is Buffalo, New York. I know many of you have seen the work of my good friend, Joe Minicozy. Joe and his team at Urban 3 out of Asheville do productivity maps. So I'm going to show you right now, if you think of a farmer going out and spreading seed across a field, the parts of the field that grow up the most robustly, we say that's the most productive. That's where you get the most bushels per acre. Well, from a city, we measure productivity in terms of value per acre. Where do we get the most productive land use? This is Buffalo, New York. Despite the decline, despite the neglect, despite really decades and decades of bad investments, can you point to the traditional downtown of Buffalo? It's not only this repository of wealth, it absolutely dwarfs in performance everything that we build subsequent. We see this in cities of all types, of all kinds. We can go to northern cities, we can go to southern cities, we can go to large cities and small cities and mid-sized cities. We can go to cities on water, we can go to cities in mountains, we can go to cities on plains. We see the same exact thing over and over and over, where we have pre-depression development patterns, where we have the complex adaptive system, even in its atrophied case, even in places where it's been neglected and fallen behind and even been blighted, even places that are occupied by the poorest people in our communities. What we see is that they financially outperform everything that we've built subsequent to World War II. They are repositories of wealth and financial productivity. This is a little city near where I live, Crosby, Minnesota. I did some planning work for Crosby a long time ago now. When I went there, they said, Chuck, we've got some great stuff happening out here. We've got some great stuff happening out here, but these core neighborhoods here are just a disaster. We've got to figure out how to get some of this stuff torn down and rebuilt. And then we showed them where all their wealth is. Their wealth is in those poor neighborhoods. They're in the neighborhoods where all their poor people live. What we have come to appreciate and understand at Strong Towns is that we don't need any more growth in the pattern we've been doing it. We don't need this kinetic growth machine. In fact, the kinetic growth machine is the problem. It's the thing that is causing us distress. It is the thing that is bankrupting our community. It is the thing that is creating wealth inequality and social tension, and all of the political and social and cultural problems that we struggle with so deeply. We actually need to shift our cities back to being engines of stability, engines of wealth creation, engines of real prosperity. This can only be done from the bottom up. And so we're going to talk for the rest of this about the subtitle of the book that we released last year, Strong Towns. The subtitle is A Bottom-Up Revolution to Rebuild American Prosperity. What needs to happen today is that our cities need to, in a sense, thicken up. We need to go back to the things that we've built and ask questions about how do we make better use of them? Instead of what is the new frontage road we can build? What is the new highway we can add? What is the new bit of infrastructure we can install? The thing we need to obsess about is how do we take all of this stuff that we've built that is not productive enough to sustain itself and actually bring it closer to productivity? This is a very nuanced type of question. And it's one that requires a block by block, street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood understanding of what's going on. That type of awareness cannot happen from the top down. It cannot happen from a centralized location. There's no set of programs that will make this work. On the flip side, this is something that we all can do. Every city in North America has the capacity to become a strong town. It doesn't take money. It doesn't take resources. It doesn't take, a flood of outside capital or programs. It takes us redirecting our existing energies and capacities into doing something more productive. Let's talk about what this would look like. I want to give you a saying that comes from Silicon Valley. And I think we can all kind of get our minds around. I did this talk yesterday with a group from Trinidad and Tobago, which was utterly fascinating. And we talked a little bit about the messiness or the complexity of building places. And there's a certain messiness, or there's a certain kind of like, I'm struggling for the right word. I want to say like cleanliness, but that's not what it is. It's like order that comes with modernity. Affluent societies can order themselves that from a very superficial way seems like clean, put together, thought out. I want to try to dissuade you or let you dig a little bit deeper into that. So understand, from Silicon Valley, this insight has been given to us. Innovation that happens from the top down tends to be orderly but dumb, while innovation that happens from the bottom up tends to be chaotic but smart. If we go out and ask people, do you prefer development that is dumb or development that is smart? People will say, well, I very much prefer smart. Give me smart every time. Yet if we introduce people to development patterns that are orderly or chaotic, as an affluent society, we have an extreme reaction, and we demand orderly styles of development. We demand that our development be orderly. If you want to think about and grasp what I'm talking about, imagine the last time you were at a traffic signal at 1 a.m. You're sitting at a red light. You can see miles in every direction. Do you go through? No. You subordinate your ability to think and react for yourself. You dumb down the system because we have an allegiance, in a sense, to order. We appreciate the order that these systems create. If we want innovation, we generally think about it as being a change in a program or a change in a system. I want you to start thinking about innovation as a relaxing of order at the local level. When we're talking about complex adaptive systems, we're talking about systems that are not chaotic. Rainforests are not chaotic. They have an emergent order. Traditional cities are not chaotic. They have an emergent order. But what you see is that at a very base level, at the very ground level, at the very, in our sense, block or neighborhood level, there's an ability to adapt and evolve and change over time in response to opportunities and stresses. Here's another one of these maps. This one is not a productivity map like the other ones I showed you. This one you should think of more as a profit and loss map. This is the city of Lafayette, Louisiana. Every place where you see blue are properties that pay more annually in taxes and fees to the city than they require in ongoing maintenance. Every place where you see red is the exact opposite. These are places that require more to service and maintain than they pay collectively in taxes and fees on an annual basis. The map looks similar to the other ones. You've got your core downtown in the middle. This crescent of blue right here are essentially like the poorest neighborhoods in the community. Let me give you a glimpse of what these look like. In the upper right there is the core downtown. In the bottom right is one of those blue neighborhoods. And just so we're clear here, the analysis that we did was based on the assumption that the city would diligently perform all of the ongoing maintenance that they had promised to do. So they would go out and fix the streets, maintain the sidewalks, keep the streetlights running, provide police protection, provide fire protection, mow the ditches. The fact that they're clearly not doing that in that bottom right doesn't negate the analysis. It actually would only make that blue line higher. The city's actually making more profit, in a sense, off of that neighborhood in the bottom right because they're not providing the service. They are collecting the tax, they are collecting the fees, but they're not providing the service. So just so we're clear on that. These red areas are very familiar to us. They're places we know. Here's what they look like in Lafayette. You've got your big box stores, your strip malls, your franchise drive-through restaurants, your gas stations, your windy, curvy streets, the cul-de-sac places, that kind of thing. In Lafayette, Louisiana, the median family pays $1,500 a year in taxes to the city. They'll pay other taxes to the parish and to the school district and what have you, but $1,500 goes to the city. In order for the city to maintain everything that they have built, median taxes would need to go from $1,500 a year to $9,200 a year. That's 1 out of every $5 a family makes. We need to get sent back to the city, in a sense, just to maintain what they have already built. This is not going to happen. It will never happen. And so at some point in the future, the city of Lafayette, and they're already struggling with this mightily, has to make decisions on, what road do we maintain? What road do we let fall apart? What pipe do we repair? What pipe do we let go? What neighborhood do we keep? What neighborhood do we walk away from? I want us to, look at this again through this lens of a complex adaptive system, because what I'm often asked when I show this map, it is to explain why. Last year, I gave a presentation at the House of Representatives with the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and I showed them this map, and we talked about it. And the question I got was, how explain this? Because this is not what we think we should be seeing. But then the immediate follow-up question was, what can we legislate? What, like, 1 or 2 things can we require cities to do that would give us more blue and less red? What is it? And my answer was very dissatisfying to them. My answer was this: I can't really explain to you why this is this way. It's kind of spooky. It's a pattern we see over and over. And as soon as you say, well, it's this, you can go to another city that doesn't have that and they have the same pattern. It's kind of spooky. And it defies, like all complex systems, it defies simple explanation. Let me give you a couple of things to think about in Lafayette that may or may not apply to you, but kind of give you a basis to think about some of the complexities of a system like this. In Lafayette, Louisiana, you were building a city in a swamp. The first people who went there built their city in essentially a swamp. Well, guess where the high ground is in Lafayette, Louisiana? It's generally this blue area here. All the blue area, the profitable place, the place that's paying more in taxes than it has in cost, is the high ground. And here's the amazing thing about the high ground. God drains it for you. So your cost of providing drainage infrastructure is really low. As you go out into some of these outer areas, especially out here, what you're looking at is development that is in drained swamps. And so there are big pumping systems, there are big drainage systems that make this place, in a sense, developable in a modern sense. Very high costs for different set of returns. Along with this, we found a number of places in this blue area where, if you look at the home, sewage would run from the house in a small pipe into a large pipe, drain down to a lift pump, and be pumped out to their sewage treatment facility. We found places in these red areas out here, particularly on the northern side, where sewage would run from the house in a small pipe, run into a larger pipe, drain down to a lift pump where it would be pumped a series of sometimes up to 24 different times before it reached that same treatment facility. Understand that every residential home in Lafayette pays the same bill. So the revenue is the same, the costs are dramatically different. That's another factor in this map. I saw that Ann Sussman was on this call, and maybe she will correct me or be able to elaborate a little bit on some of her genius insights that I quoted in my book. But I want to talk just briefly about thigmotaxis. There's this concept that it comes from biology called thigmotaxis. And thigmotaxis is the propensity of organic things to hug the wall, to stay near the edge. If you read your Jane Jacobs talks about humans as having this propensity to stay near the edge of a wall. Christopher Alexander talks about us being edge-loving creatures. If you think of like a room, we tend to stay towards the side. A street, you feel more comfortable up against a wall. If you think about like a deer in a field, a deer will stick next to the edge of a field. A mouse will tend to not run across the middle of the floor. They tend to stick towards the edge. If you put a microscope look in a petri dish at microorganisms, you'll see that they have a random kind of movement to them until you put a metal rod in the dish, and then something very spooky will happen. They start to line up along the edge of the rod and move in a similar direction. Evolution is, in its essence, a conservative process. It conserves strategies that are beneficial and passes them on. So somewhere in your brainstem, somewhere in my brainstem, is a little thing that makes us feel more comfortable in environments where there are edges than where there are no edges. I want you to look at this development pattern in that context. What do you see in the core downtown of Lafayette? You see edges. Right? You see an edge condition. They have built their human habitat in a way that comforts this primal urge. Look at this struggling neighborhood here. Again, one of the first neighborhoods built in Lafayette. There's no edge condition. These buildings are spread out, but you can see how in a complex adaptive system, as things would continue to grow, those gaps would be filled in over time. You would get buildings that, in a sense, resulted in that edge condition. Look at any more mature neighborhood, and that's what you will see. And so what you're looking at here is like the very first phase or the very first stage of a human habitat being built. And ultimately, just like bees build beehives that makes them fully into bees, we built habitat that would make us fully into humans. That's what you're looking at here, is the very early stages of that. Out here, in the red, we see none of this. We see no thigmotaxis. We see no need to, comfort primal urges, to make us feel more fully human, to, provide us a level of, just social, anxiety quieting. And, we have the propensity in modern America to be hypertense, to have high anxiety, to, have all these things that we ascribe to many different causes. I'm not saying that modern development causes ADHD, But I am saying that human habitat of the past was designed to fit us. It has a spooky innate wisdom to it. Let me give you one final example to kind of explain why this stuff works in this spooky way. Imagine the first people going to Lafayette and building their city. They all understood if you were building a house, you intuitively knew that like the bar of viability was that whatever street you were going to have, whatever stuff you were going to have in front of your house, if you and your immediate neighbors were not able to sustain that and take care of that, it was not going to last. That was like the minimum threshold for success, is that the wealth you had, the capacity you had to at least take care of the stuff right in front of you. Whether that meant you and your neighbors getting shovels and rakes and going out and, you know, grading out the street twice a year, or whether it meant you paying taxes to someone else. That was like the minimum viability threshold. And if you didn't meet that, in an evolutionary sense, like you were going to go away, you were not going to survive. How would you have built your house in such a situation? Well, you would have built your house narrow and deep. And you would have built it narrow and deep because now you had less amount of frontage on that expensive piece of street. And you were going to share that burden, share that cost of maintaining that with many, many more people. Now, let's say you create a kinetic growth machine. You're not really worried about getting that complex feedback from your local environment, adapting, doing things differently. All you're worried about is growth, unemployment, GDP, just repeat over and over and over again, because that is a good unto itself. What happens to your home? Well, that same house just turns. It just rotates 90 degrees. And so now instead of having a house that is narrow and deep, you have one that is broad and shallow. This is how you go from 5 feet of pipe per person to 50 feet of pipe per person without, you know, adding any real value. On the left, you see a development pattern evolved out of a complex adaptive system where feedback, painful feedback and positive feedback, would drive the next level of adaptation. On the right, you see a complicated system, one that is engineered from the top to achieve a couple of objectives that really at the local level are no longer operative. How do we start to get more of the left and less of that right development pattern? Well, I'm going to give you a few things that we can do. And they're very easy to explain. They're very difficult to do. And so I'm not going to pretend that like any of this is super easy, but I want you to be thinking in this way. First of all, we need to allow everywhere at all times the next increment of intensity by right. We can't have a complex adaptive system if there's no ability to adapt. And so when you look out across the landscape, if you are not capable of taking the existing building on a site and in a sense improving it to the next level of intensity, you need to change your code, change your ordinance, change your approach so that that is allowed. Let me give you just a simple way to think of this. If you have a neighborhood of single family homes, there should be no regulatory friction for turning that into a neighborhood of duplexes or triplexes. You should not have to go to your neighbors and ask permission. You should not have to go grovel in front of a bunch of committees to get approval. You should be able to walk into City Hall at 9 a.m. with a completed application, walk out by noon with your permit, and go convert that house into a duplex. That's what bottom up actually looks like in practice. Now, before everybody freaks out, let me share with you one of the sayings we have at Strong Towns. No neighborhood should experience radical change, but no neighborhood should be exempt from change. We've developed this YIMBY-NIMBY, the yes and no in my backyard debate, that is very, very dysfunctional. And it's based on the way we implement this kinetic growth machine today at the local level. The way we tend to implement it with modern zoning and modern finance and you know, modern development approach is we say 95% of our city will experience no change whatsoever. And 5% of our city, you know, whatever 5% is either disenfranchised or where we've kicked people out or where the development capital is going, that 5% will be so radically altered that it will be unrecognizable 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Instead of a pattern of development of enforced stasis, which from a biological standpoint is not viable, and radical transformation, which also from a biological standpoint is not viable. What we need is a system that evolves and adapts continuously over a broad area. To do this, we also need to consciously lower the bar of entry. I show you the pop-up shacks again in my hometown. Understand what these are. This is where people got a start. You would not have had the wealthiest people in North America move to a little city like mine and say, all right, I'm moving in here and building my mansion. There's nothing else here, but there will be someday. No, you would never have done that. What you had was you had upstarts. You had places for people to start with nothing and end up with something. We like to envision that as like part of the American dream, part of our ethos, that you can start with nothing and end up with something. Yet we've reduced those mechanisms down, so it's very, very difficult. We need to bring those back. Let me give you two examples of this. This is something that we call in my community a little house or a tiny house. Our ancestors would have called this a house. There really is nothing bizarre about this and no reason why we should call it a tiny house. In fact, if you walk through most of the neighborhoods in my community, you can either pick these out because they're still there, or you can see the vestiges of them. Because what this really is a starter home. It is a small place for people with limited resources to get a start. And we all know what happens to these places over time. You get a start. As the first kid is born, you do a little addition on the back. Now here comes the second kid. You put on a second story. You build out the porch in the front. You continue to add on. This grows and evolves and changes along with you. You need a little bit of help. Your neighbor comes over. They need help. You go help them. This is the way we built cities all across North America. It's the way people of limited means start to build wealth in a place. Here, let me give you another example from a commercial standpoint. This is from Muskegon, Michigan. Muskegon, a rapidly deindustrialized city, went from a population, I want to say of like 80,000 to down to like 25,000 in a very short period of time. Had a downtown that was vacant, and they were trying to get the businesses filled, but people couldn't afford the sprinkler systems and the ADA improvements and all the stuff that they needed to make those old buildings viable. And so what they said is that, you know what, we have very entrepreneurial people in this community. We have people doing great things. We need to help them get a start. And so what they did is they lowered the bar of entry. The city went out, they bought a bunch of storage sheds. Like these are literally like just little tiny sheds. They painted them up funky colors. They filled in a gap in their downtown streetscape, and they rented them out to local entrepreneurs at very like cheap prices. Local entrepreneurs, basically crazy people who don't know they can fail, and allowed them a way to come in and get a start at very, very low risk to figure out how they could make a business work. What can I do that would be of service to my neighbors, enough value that I can make a living doing it? That's what you have here. Here's the amazing thing. A lot of people started here and it didn't work out. Their business wasn't a very good idea. A lot of those people retooled and came back and tried again because they're entrepreneurial people. A lot of them went out and started doing stuff, and it was great. It was fantastic. Guess what? The downtown's completely full now. A lot of these people graduated from these little startups. They proved their concept. They got the experience they needed to know how to run a business, and they were able to, with confidence, then take that next leap up and move into that larger space. This is how we create entrepreneurs. And it's fascinating to me today because we do have a crisis of entrepreneurialism in this country. And the main crisis is that the most entrepreneurial people that we have are generally the poorest people in our society. And we have, through all kinds of good reasons, through all kinds of benevolent reasons, as part of this kinetic growth machine, said, here's the bar you have to cross in order to participate in this system. Here's the bar you need to cross in order to start a business, in order to open up, in order to sell things, in order to produce. We need to lower that bar of entry so that we can invite all these entrepreneurial people into our game and help them, allow them to create that next iteration of change and transform our communities. As a final thought, we need to completely reimagine our public investment process. The way we do capital investments today is very tied into the planning profession, the engineering profession, and the way capital is allocated in our society from the top down. When we look at local governments, what we see is that they orient vertically. They orient towards the flows of capital. What money can I get from the federal government to do projects? What money can I get from the state government to do projects? What capital can we get from Wall Street and other developers to bring into our community to do projects? What local governments need to do to build wealth in their communities and to actually create enduring prosperity is to reorient themselves horizontally, to actually focus not on the flows of capital, but on the needs of people in their community. Because if we want to thicken up, if we want to make better use of what we've already built, what we have to understand intuitively is how people are struggling to use what we have already built. Let me walk you through the 4-step process that we have created at Strong Towns to do this type of investment. Step number 1, go out and humbly observe where people in the community struggle. Go out with humility and observe, like literally observe, like walk with people, experience the community along with them. And with humility, which really is about freeing yourselves of your preconceived notions or your preconceived thoughts, or what you think should be or is, and actually opening yourselves up to possibilities that you didn't imagine. By experiencing the community and observing how people are having a difficult time using the city as it has been built. Step number 2 then, ask the question, what is the next smallest thing we can do right now to address that struggle? Not what is the thing that will fix this for all time, not what is the thing that we can get a big grant to do. What is the thing that we can do right now with straw bales and duct tape and cones and paint that will make this struggle just a little bit easier? Step number 3 then, do that thing. Go do it right now. Don't form a committee to study it. Don't bring in a consultant. Don't debate it for weeks and weeks and months. Go out and make use, go out and do that thing right now. Put it in place today. Step number 4 then, repeat that process. Repeat it over and over and over. Allow the feedback of people within your systems to drive your next step and your next step and your next step. By observing humbly where people struggle, what we can identify are the lowest risk, highest returning, most urgent investments in our communities. What we can do is actually start to, as Jane Jacobs described, get back to cities that are co-created, cities that are not where people pay their taxes and then expect certain levels of service, but places where the government is oriented along with us to co-create this project of building a successful place, a complex, adaptive human habitat. We can continue down this path. This is a city in Oklahoma that I was able to spend some time in. Very nice people, very well-intentioned, but oriented vertically. They were able to go get federal dollars to help them redo their streetscape because they figured that that was the problem they had. And so now they have a brand new streetscape with decorative sidewalks and nice lights and banners, but their people are still struggling and they've seen no real results from it. This may make us feel good in the short term. It may make us feel like we've accomplished something, but that is only because we have the capacity to ignore what is actually going on. We need to, if we want that feedback, we actually need to go out and expose ourselves to it in ways that may, in the short term, prove to be very, very painful, but in the long term will be very rewarding. Because when we do, we start to see things like this. This is a little project in Memphis, Tennessee. I think I actually closed with this one last time I was at Build Maine. It is one of my favorite projects because here's a group of people who went out and with duct tape and with paint and with straw bales and cones, said, we're going to make this street just a little bit better. We're not going to make it perfect. We're not going to fix every problem that's ever been out here. We are just going to do what we can to make it a little bit better. And with no public investment, with public investment of zero, with just some elbow grease and some love and some passion for this place, these private residents were able to do something that has been utterly transformative. If you go out to Broad Avenue today, you actually see these temporary things that were put in about 7 years ago now. I was out there last October. The city has gone in and made these 2 blocks permanent now. They put in actual real curb, actual elevated curb, put in some nice light, done some things because these shops that were once vacant have now come back. And here's the awesome thing, and this shows you how smart the people in Memphis are. If you go out to these 2 blocks and you see now the permanence, look out 2 or 3 blocks in each direction. And what you see is the next version of this, the next version of the temporary, the next version of the next step of responding to where people struggle. We all have the capacity to do this. There's nothing in our budgets. There's nothing in our, professionalism. There's nothing in our, capacity to grasp or understand for us that keeps us from doing these types of investments. And literally, these are the types of investments that will not only make us wealthy and stable and prosperous, but will do so in a broad way that cannot help but improve people's lives. This is our website, strongtowns.org. This conversation, this very conversation we're having today, is one that we have daily. We have, like I said earlier, 3 articles a day that we publish. We have an entire now online learning academy that we welcome you to take courses in, and have launched a community site at community.strongtowns.org to connect people across North America who are working on ways to build strong towns. So I'm grateful to be here. I'm excited to take the next, looks like hour, and answer questions and have a conversation about how we can make more strong towns in Maine and New Hampshire, right? And Vermont and all of New England. Yes.
Thank you so much, Chuck. That was fantastic. We will have this video recording for attendees within the next week, along with presentation materials, links to Chuck's books, and other materials that were mentioned today. So normally I'd like to take a quick second to mention the next week's speaker, but as it is our final speaker today, I'd like to mention the Incremental Development Alliance workshop that we've been talking about, which will be hosted by AARP Maine, Maine Downtown Center, New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, and Build Maine. There will be 2 half-day workshops on September 24th and 25th, and we are beginning to sell tickets to this event soon, but we're limited to under 100 people, so be sure to sign up for a save the date form, which I'll be putting in the chat. We are looking for sponsors that want to support the training of small-scale developers in their own communities. So if you're a municipality, this might be a good way to address some of those vacancies in your downtown. And next we have the questions. So I'll kick it to Kara.
Great. There are actually a lot of questions back at the beginning of the presentation when you were showing some of the extruded maps.
Yeah.
One relates to the tax system. And the question is, could all this boil down to a smarter taxation system? And that was Justin Barker who asked that question.
Yeah. Let me answer that in this way. No. And I say that I do recognize that our tax system is ridiculously distorting, particularly at the local level. And one of the things that we're seeing right now across the country is that cities that are very dependent on sales tax and have done some, ridiculously risky things in the belief that sales tax would always be there, are now facing calamity. I mean, really, really structurally difficult times. So yes, our tax system is very distorted. It's very distorting. And a lot of what we've done are, you can think of as incentives responding to that tax system. I don't think that fixing the tax system alone is enough. We did a series at Strong Towns about the land value tax. And in fact, if you just type Strong Towns land value tax into Google, you will get an ebook that we put together that goes through the land value tax, which I think is the most intelligent way to do taxes at the local level. It's what I would recommend. And if I could, transform tax systems across the country overnight myself, I would have land value taxes at the local government level. That's what we would do. People who love the land value tax are often religious about it in like a zealot kind of way. They sometimes represent it as like a cure for all fiscal imbalances at the local level, as well as something that will cure cancer and solve Mideast peace. I think it is a tool in the toolbox, and is one that I think could go a long way. But let's not kid ourselves. We have a lot of work to do, and a tax system change is not, it's not the thing that will fix all. Even if we had that change, we would still have like a ton of work to do. Also recognize that because of the way we have our tax system set up now, there's a ton of resistance to that change. And so, in places where a land value tax or a different tax, the reason we have the taxing system we have right now is because it has evolved out of people not wanting to be taxed, but wanting the money. And so you tend to like favor invisible taxes or taxes that are quite disconnected from what you're actually doing. And, there's a reason for that. I think the more we localize things, the more we will get nuance and differences in tax systems across cities. And I actually think that would be a very good thing.
Great. Ian, are you online? You've had a number of questions, and I don't know if you want to get any answers to those now. They're related to some of the early points you asked about Fresno allowing extraterritorial jurisdiction and annexation, and something about was homeownership considered, and I'm not sure what that question actually connected to at this point.
Well, the Fresno question was, I think it's a contemporary question. So extraterritorial jurisdictions and annexation, it's a racist activity of planning that we've done over the last century. And then the main question that I had was really about the extruded maps that you had. Is there some way that, is there some formula of variables that could be placed on top of that to represent the cost versus the value? I have done some analysis for the city of Sanford in Maine on the value side, and we do see lower value in our rental property stock. So we've been attempting to promote home ownership without losing a lot of our building stock. But I was wondering if there was, I scanned through your book because it's sitting on the city manager's desk, but if there was a relatively simple formula to apply that water, pavement, sewer, police coverage, all those aspects, that's what I'm looking for.
No, there's not. and I think, this is one of the things that I do get into this in the book, and I think this is a really important point to make. When we analyze costs, you can take a block of street and look at the pipe in the ground and say, okay, it's a block of street here and a block of street there. The pipe's the same. And it's not. You may have one that's in the water table and one that is not. You may have one that is, upstream as opposed to downstream, which would change the size. You might have one that, is in bad soil versus good soil. And you can have costs, that differ by magnitudes from one to the other. The same with streets, the same with sidewalks. Building a block of street in San Francisco, where you've got a lot of topography, is way different than building it in, Nebraska. They're really, the places that have done that kind of work where they've said, well, here's the cost of a block of street, or here's the cost of a mile of roadway. I think have oversimplified something from an expense side to the point of ridiculousness. And I think people like me who have the engineering background and have done these kind of estimations look at that and say, well, that's just kind of silly. That being said, the important takeaway from the maps that I showed you in the beginning, the ones where I was going through a bunch of them over and over and over that Joe's team had put together, is that those all just look at revenue. Those all just look at the wealth that is created, actually, not even the revenue, just the total value per acre, the financial productivity. When I got to the Lafayette map, though, the Lafayette map actually showed you all the costs as well. We went through as part of that study. I joined that study because I wanted to help answer the very question you're asking. Here's how I asked it slightly differently. How closely does the value per acre map, which is really ridiculously easy to produce and create, and that data is very easy to accumulate, how closely does that correlate with a more rigorous profit and loss map? I'll just give you like an order of magnitude. When we did like a standard profit and loss map or a standard productivity map for a whole county, back 5 years ago when the Lafayette one was done, I think Joe's team was like 30,000 for that. To do the entire profit and loss analysis for Lafayette was like almost $500,000. So you're talking about a level of intensity that's really, really high. We went through and analyzed every street, what the costs were, how many lanes there were, how wide it was. We looked at all the places that had sidewalks and calculated those costs, where the pipes were, the pumps were. We created like 36 different maps that showed all these intricacies of costs, and we mashed them all together and got that profit and loss map. Here's the incredible thing. If I were to show you Lafayette's financial productivity map, a map that like you and I with the data set could put together in an afternoon, and I were to show you the profit and loss map, a map that would take hundreds of thousands of dollars and year plus of effort to put together, they're going to look the exact same. There will be slight nuances. And, if you looked at individual parcels, you'd be like, well, there's an exception to this or whatever, but they're basically like the same map. From looking at them, you would not be able to tell which one was which. And so what the conclusion that I had from that was financial productivity is a really good proxy, both for cost and for benefit, merged together. It's a really good proxy for that. That was my theory. Joe and I were at Harvard a couple of years ago. I was actually giving a speech there, and Joe went to grad school there, and he's from New York, and he wound up in the area. And so him and I he came to my talk. And then afterwards we went down in the library and we were looking through old planning manuals, old planning books. And we kept coming across these planning books from like the late 1800s, early 1900s that would describe town planning. And here's what you do. And they all referred to value per acre. And they would have tables and tables of financial productivity. And here's what you're trying to achieve from a productivity standpoint to make this viable. Here's the productivity goal for this type of development, this type of development. And it was clear to me that our ancestors, and let's define that as broadly as we can, the people who were doing this kind of work had recognized, largely through their trial and error efforts, that if you wanted a place to endure, you had to make it productive. And that was like an easy, quick way to determine if something was going to work as opposed to, what I think we would do today, which is to kind of tech it up as much as we, could with data and inference and exception. Is build stuff that has high financial productivity and it endures. I think that's just like the conclusion I made from all that research.
That's awesome. That's super helpful. As we're actively looking at doing some of this analysis work at the state level for communities across the state. Had a good question here from Alex. What should be the role of regional planning commissions, counties, MPOs, and other regional organizations in supporting bottom-up strong towns approaches?
My gut reaction to that is they should just go away. And I will elaborate on that because I know that's not, the full answer. A lot of regional planning today, it fits one of two kind of channels. One is it has been set up as part of the kinetic growth machine as an implementation mechanism of federal policy. So the MPO, for example, is, if you want federal transportation dollars, you set up, a transportation planning organization. They will go out and say, we're building new here, we're building new here, here's where we, and they'll put the plan together, and then the plan gets sent up the vertical chain. And, that's the way money is allocated, and, project lists are made and all this. The other vein I've seen with regional planning is, all right, let's, we have a desire to attract businesses and a desire to grow and a desire to, see new people move in here. So we need to do things like, let's standardize ordinances across this area, or let's standardize plans across this area. Let's make it as easy as we can for that outside capital to flow in and be operative within our communities. The question was, what would we do with regional bodies, to build a strong town? And the reason I answered go away is because I like both of these approaches that I see them doing largely are counterproductive. They tend to take the air out of the room. They tend to be like they tend to overwhelm everything else. They also tend to, dumb things down in a sense. If I were running a regional body that was not going to dissolve and go away, but was going to be helpful, I would do what I can to make it more of I guess two things: a servant model of service, in the sense that I am going to orient myself to the expressions that we're seeing out of neighborhoods, out of blocks, out of cities, and I'm going to make that my focus. And I also would become a repository of, in a sense, like knowledge and best practices. Here's what this city over here is doing. Let me make sure that this city over here is connected to that and knows and sees it and understands that. I would be doing less like directing and less, channeling of money to the projects that I've identified, and more trying to be of assistance, broadly or narrowly defined, to the efforts that are emerging locally. I know that people who work in these systems will say, well, that's what we do. That's not what we do. We're very oriented towards the capital flows, and I think we need to orient towards the urgent needs coming out of our places.
Great. Let's see. Bernice asks, what is the secret sauce in the success you've seen in towns and cities overhauling systems to embrace incremental?
I know it came to my mind first, so I'll say it. Poverty. People who have affluence tend to not like chaos. People who live in chaos tend to embrace the idea of making things better. So the places that we've seen be the most successful and have the most gains and actually, start to emerge are generally places with either outstanding leadership, like very visionary leadership. A place like Pensacola, Florida, which is fairly affluent, but does have a lot of poverty, but has just, utterly transformed themselves by having a very broad, very humble community conversation led by some philanthropists and some others who have had great leadership. Or they've been places who have largely been abandoned. Broad Avenue that I showed you in Memphis, areas of Shreveport and Baltimore that we've seen be really successful. Places where, they have been less worried about hurting feelings within bureaucracies and hierarchies. They've been less worried about stepping on toes. They've been less worried about, is this going to work or not? And how will it affect my, the perception of me or my reelection or my standing in the community? And have been more interested in how do we just try things and get things started? I think a lot of what holds us back is the idea that we could fail. But the reality is that with complex adaptive systems, failure is a feature. It's not a flaw. I mean, the idea is that you are supposed to fail. You're supposed to try many, many, many different things. If coronavirus was, something that emerged from nature and not within a lab, and I know there's some debate over that, and I don't want to get into the controversy of that debate. But if it emerged from, nature, what you're looking at is the result of, millions, billions, maybe trillions, I don't know, of evolutionary rolls of the dice, all of which failed until this one attempt. And, nature doesn't lament all those failures. Nature embraces those failures as a way to learn. So for us, I think the way we have set up our cities, our societies, our culture tends to be very adverse to trying things that could fail. This is why we have committees. Because in a committee, no one individual failed. It's like the committee that failed. And we can all say, yeah, committees suck and we know they failed and, all that. But the reality is that if we want to improve things, if we want to thicken up our neighborhoods, we have to be willing to try low-level things and see them not work, and then go back and not, castigate ourselves for that failure, but actually learn from it and try something new. I was doing something here in my hometown once, and I talked to my dad about it. It was actually a contest. We had a little bit of money, and what we were doing as part of this project was we had created a deal where we said, we want 20 people to do a $100 project in a neighborhood to make the neighborhood better. We're not going to ask you what the project is. We're not going to make you go through any type of application process. If you are interested in this, we will give you $100. And the only thing we ask of you is that you go spend the $100 making the neighborhood better. I told this to my dad, and he said, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You're going to have someone who goes and buys Christmas tree lights and puts them on their house and says, thanks for the tree lights. The neighborhood's all better. And I said, that's fine, Dad. They can go do that like that. Like there will be some people who do that. But the whole point of that was it was the first round of a broader competition, because in the second round, we were going to take we took the top 5 and we gave them each $400 to go out and do something in the neighborhood. And then the idea was that as the contest went on, we would eventually narrow it down to one person who we were going to give $5,000 to go out and do something utterly transformative. So what you look at is that you spent $100 to weed out all the people who were not going to do something, that great. $100 was something we could afford to lose, not a big deal. Businesses do this all the time. This is the way that, I had the quote from Silicon Valley. This is the way that they do things all the time. They're like, we're not going to roll out the brand new version of Gmail. We're going to try this little adaptation, and we'll let 5,000 people do it and see what they like and see how they respond and see if, it works. And if it does, we'll ramp it up and start to roll it out in a broader sense. Only places that fail do things in large leaps all at once, universally to everyone. The reality is if we did do that project, if you went and tried something like that, someone like my dad is going to show up at your council meeting and say, look at the money they're wasting in this community. They, put Christmas lights on my neighbor's house. Why are we spending our money that way? And so to me, we need to have a cultural conversation that embraces low-level failure as a path to learning and rejects large, risky projects for what they are, which is large and risky, even if we've seen other people do it and other people, we're following a well-worn path. We're still doing something ridiculously risky.
Great. Kevin asks, he says, Maine is a home rule state. 400 plus or minus towns can write their own rules. How does a small group of passionate Build Mainers help get them to see the light?
It's a great question. And
Hold on.
actually,
and it has to do, sorry, Chuck, it has to do in part with your comment about regional planning offices, because I've been thinking that is a vehicle in which we can help educate and hopefully implement policy change.
Yeah.
But as we're trying to do this, it's like, that is a concern I still have is, all right, how do we actually get 400 towns to buy in?
That's awesome. And you're thinking about this the right way. I think the answer is you are not going to get 400 towns to buy in. You are going to get one town to buy in. And if that is, Carrie, you and I talked about Augusta a little bit, and, some of the transformative things they have been doing lately. To me, what you want is, you want those stories, you want those places that people can touch and feel, and you want to wrap a narrative around that. I showed you in my presentation, Muskegon, Michigan. I guarantee you, if any of us went to Muskegon, Michigan together, we would find all kinds of things that they're doing terribly wrong. And we would go through this list and we'd be like, oh, that's not good, and that's not good, and that's not good. But you know what I presented to you? I didn't present to you the whole story of Muskegon and all their, good and bad. I presented to you, here's a success story from Muskegon. And you all can do that. You have enough success stories happening in your region where you can say, as a regional body, hey, here's the great thing they did here. Here's why they did it. Here's what they were responding to. Maybe you have this problem too. Here's what they did. And then here's the effect that it had. And what we're doing now is we're spreading success and knowledge throughout the region. If you don't have a success story like that, you go find someone from somewhere else. We publish these all the time, and you're free to use them and point to them. But the idea is that we want to start sharing broadly with people, not just the policy people, not just the people at City Hall, but literally the influencers, the Rotary clubs, the what have you. We want people talking about the communities in a different way. And so find those successes, and, even if it's a narrow success where it's surrounded by failure, even if it's a community of people that you don't personally like because they've been, whatever, if they're doing something right, make a big deal out of it, share it. And you won't get 400 communities to buy in, but you might get 2 or 3. Now you have a trend, right? And now you can say cities across the region are doing this. Look, we've got 4 now that are doing this, and here's why, and here's what it's produced. And so when I talk about regional entities being a repository of best practices, that's what I'm talking about. Here is the struggle. Here's what they did. And not necessarily go out and copy exactly what they did, but copy this thought process to help you get to this result. Does that make sense, Kevin?
It does, and it goes back to something that Joe Minicosi and I were talking about. It's the peer pressure. So if you can get one or a handful to do it, and you show them that they're doing it, showing everyone else will do it, they may jump on board.
So I think about the audiences that I present to in three broad categories. There is elected officials, there's professionals and like technical people, and then there's, you know, the general public. My favorite to present to is the general public. They like, yes, this all makes sense. We want this, like, let's do it. They're the easiest audience because they're like, this, you know, we've been thinking this for years, like, thank you. The elected officials are interesting, and I love talking to them because they're like, why aren't my professional staff telling me this? Like, what is, like, this is really weird. I really like it, but I'm kind of scared. And the number one question I get from elected officials is, what other community has done this? What other place can I point to that has done this so I don't have to like be the pioneer, be the first one in, I don't have to be the first one through that door who's going to get shot. Like I want to be second or third. I don't want to be first. And so I have come to recognize that the way we get beyond that fear is we have to give them examples. The danger is if you give the third group, the technical professionals, examples, they want to institutionalize it and make it into a cookbook. And so they're like, oh, decorative lights work? All right, bam, $10 million Tiger grant to put in decorative lights. And you're like, no. What works is the thought process, right? Here's how we work incrementally. Here's how we figure out answers. Here's how we try things and learn from it. And so, you know, I think we just have to be very careful that to elected officials, we're giving them enough examples where they don't feel like they're the first through the door. But with the technical people, we're not institutionalizing an outcome as much as we're institutionalizing a thought process or an approach. Does that nuance make sense?
It does, and it helps. And I've seen it exactly how you've described it. So.
Yeah. So, you know, if you're putting these together, and I think you can watch sometimes how we do it, we're not always perfect, but we try to do this where, you know, when we tell a success story, we, you know, here's what they did. We also try to wrap it in a little bit of this deference to complexity and the process and how they failed before they got to the success and why the failure was important in the success, that kind of thing.
And I do think, given my experience in Maine, an example from Maine is going to be crucial to helping get others involved or participating too. Because I can talk about projects that have worked in other states all day long, but there is this apprehension among some of the elected officials in this area to buy in without having examples from Maine. Right.
It's funny. I was on my own planning commission here in town for 3 years. And I think this wasn't my thought going in, but I think a lot of people in Strong Town's world, when they found out that I was going to be on the planning commission, thought, well, here's, you know, I'm going to say this, I say this with humility. Here's this, you know, brilliant, well-known planner who's just going to walk in and tell people how things should be. And they'll be like, oh, you know, I get it. Like, let's do it. From day one, I had zero credibility. I could explain things and people would go, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And they would never do any of them. It's like, oh, and the only thing that I found as me that would move the bar in my planning commission conversations was when I could point to other cities that had done things. And even if I had to like take and say, you know, I saw this project and it was like half-ass, it kind of worked, but it really, you know, there was some things wrong with it, but I could take it and be like, here's the great things that happened. They'd be like, oh, okay, that's enough for me to like do it because I want to do it. It makes sense. But it's that like having that thing that someone else did it gives me the confidence to move ahead. And so I guess I'm saying it doesn't matter how good your insights are. It doesn't matter how right you are or how smart you are or how eloquent you are. It is those little stories that get people, you know, from clinging to what they're at now to like being willing to take one hand off and then another hand off and then walk into what feels like the unknown. And then you have to congratulate them and you have to make them the success story. Yep. And even if their thing doesn't work perfectly, you have to, you know, talk about how brave they are and how courageous they are and how their leadership is great and they're leading to great outcomes. And, you know, it's part of building a cultural dialogue around change.
Thank you.
I have a good question from John Smith. He asks, some municipalities are charging for density bonuses during the development process using the funds for land preservation purposes, presumably as a way of creating balance between the higher density areas with open land. I am curious to hear your thoughts on that concept and if you are aware of that concept being successful in supporting this idea of thickening up.
I am aware of this concept. It would not be the thing I would do. I respect the thought process behind it, but let me give you my interpretation of the thought process behind it. The thought process behind it is we have this kinetic growth machine that wants to do this. And we really don't want them to do this. We'd rather they did something kind of adjacent to that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try to harness that machine so that if it does do this, we can also get this like ancillary good from it that kind of mitigates or makes things a little bit better. I get that trade-off. It's like a pragmatic thing. I think it is a pragmatic response to a system that is not treating our places well. I think preservation is, let me put it this way. I think our conversation around preservation tends to be one that emerges from the environmental conversation. And as such, it tends to try to co-opt or speak like a financial language in a way that is insincere. I think the case for preservation from a pure economic standpoint is massive. And I think from a community standpoint, the case for preservation in terms of a long-term viability of the community, all environmental arguments put to the side, is overwhelming. We should be doing preservation at a large scale because our communities are denuded. They don't have enough tax base or wealth to sustain themselves. They have overwhelming amount of costs. They have declining quality of life. If we want to reverse those things, what we need are real cities. And real cities are urban spaces, well-designed, comfortable, pleasant, beautiful spaces surrounded by green space and open space. That is what like the most successful urban city model is. And whether it is a tiny town or whether it is a large metropolis, it's a fractal kind of thing. It emerges the same way. We can look at this throughout history. Like this is the way cities were built, have been built. This is like a successful structure of human habitat. And so do we launder the money through some scheme to try to get land preserved in a modest way and then give up development that isn't really what we want or the style and the place we want in order to get it? I would default more toward having, we talked a little bit earlier about extraterritorial jurisdiction, and I don't know the whole impetus of that question. There was some race conversation in that, and I wasn't exactly sure where that was all going. But to me, extraterritorial jurisdiction is only a valuable tool for basically stopping development outside of the places where you can provide service and urbanism and good urban development, which essentially is everything outside of a city today, because our cities could have a century of thickening up, most of them, and not really get to the point where they're making productive use of what they built. So, I mean, let's even say we took the next 3 decades or 4 decades and did that. I would use my extraterritorial jurisdiction to not have development out there, in a sense, de facto preserve through land use regulation. And then, instead of paying people for density or what have you, I would allow that, next iteration of development, and then, let my city evolve and emerge for me. I would put the tools of my community, the feedback loops, to work, so that, something more prosperous emerge, as opposed to trying to, artificially engineer it in the current system. That was maybe a long and dissatisfying answer, but I feel like it's a dissatisfying tool as well.
There's another question. Can institutional and systematic racism be overcome in an incremental manner? How do we treat mitigating bias in invisible spaces in concert with the physical realm?
I don't know. And I think I would be being dishonest to myself and to all of you if I pretended that I did know the answer to that. Both questions really. I do know that, when we look at natural systems, what we see is that progress happens in two ways. It happens incrementally over time, and it happens in like cataclysmic events. We can think about the dinosaurs as, one mode of existence. And there are theories and debates that, dinosaurs would eventually have died out because they were too big and they were too clumsy, but they lasted hundreds of millions of years. So that seems really stupid to me. But clearly what happened was dinosaurs were, too big and not adaptable enough to survive a cataclysmic event. So what you see is this incremental change over time, and then you see a big event happen, and then like the next day, everything is different, and it starts over again, that incremental pattern. I'm reading a book right now called The Great Leveling. The Great Leveling is about income inequality, and it talks about income inequality over time and how it has this tendency to grow and grow and grow and grow and then be corrected, and then grow and grow and grow and then be corrected. And we're like, oh yeah, good. I like the correction. No, you don't, because every correction is war, disease, famine, some unrest. It is a massively traumatic thing that corrects this. And so when we get into something as complex as racism and systematic racism and equity, it's tough from an historical perspective to argue either that this will be solved, with big top-down fell swoops, or that it will be solved, through incremental action. I think what will happen, to the extent that there is a solution, or is, a time in the future where race is not a determinant of, or a determinant of one's life trajectory is not dependent on race. I think will be a combination of both incremental changes over time and like radical shifts in, in understanding and awareness. I'll give a modern analogy of this. And I know others have used this, so I'm not, pretending I have some great insight here. But if you look at, the gay rights conversation or the gay marriage conversation, this is one that as late as 2004, you had, here in Minnesota and in many other states across the country, it was a good political strategy to have on the ballot and have as major part of your campaign, I can't remember what they even called them anymore, like free marriage. Basically, marriage is one man, one woman, and this is the way we define it. And let's protect traditional marriage. You had, the Clintons in the 90s saying that. You had, early 2000s, basically like this broad political consensus that, yes, we don't want to tamper with marriage. And within one election cycle, it completely flipped. Like our understanding and awareness and the cultural sense of this completely flipped to where, we don't even really discuss it in the same way anymore. It's a completely different paradigm. Did that happen incrementally, or did that happen with a big change? Depends on your view. If you read the history of that particular shift in our cultural consciousness, it certainly happened incrementally. I mean, it started, decades and decades and decades as a nascent thought that was kind of, worked out and worked out and worked out. But then the shift happened very suddenly at the end. It's a little bit like, the way I think it was Hemingway or Twain describes bankruptcy. I went bankrupt gradually and then all at once. I think that's how change happens. So I would be I tend to resist the idea of the imposition of, the very large shift. I tend to think we need to be a little more humble in, not in our diagnosis of the problem, but in our sense of what we can accomplish by what we think should be done. And by humble, what I'm really talking about is this idea of learning as we go from, the mistakes that we all make. Again, probably a dissatisfying answer to a question that none of us are truly satisfied with, but I think that tools of top down and tools of bottom up can both be used for just and moral ends and can be used for evil ends. I just think that top down tools have, been used for evil ends to great destruction more frequently, because the ability to learn from your mistakes and adapt and change is much less in those kind of systems.
Great. Ian asks, in Stanford, we struggle with situations where predators acting in the land market depress and keep the order established and keep value low, and therefore communities depressed and oppressed. Do you have any thoughts on these situations where the market is not functioning and needs intervention?
I'm interested to know what a predator would look like in that situation. Because a lot of times, when I hear the term like predator, it is, from a Wall Street standpoint, we would call them speculators. People who are going in with large capital flows and buying up properties. So tell me what a predator is, if you don't mind. I know you don't know, Karen.
So there are two kinds of, actors where we're seeing I think you're describing situations where you're seeing communities able to develop freely, but there are certain binds in the system. One is financially structural. Say a property becomes tied up in foreclosure, won't move. It has, effects to neighboring properties, leads to a neighborhood's decline through that so-called blight, word. And then you have entities that actually do that intentionally. They seek to tie up property. They seek to find places where they can arbitrage. So they take advantage of the system. They take advantage of those foreclosure systems. They take advantage of individuals that might not be very knowledgeable, and they'll seek to make a profit in a transaction. So that happens regularly, and I was just, as I was following through with your presentation there, I was saying, okay, well, I agree. I was looking at that image that you showed of the parking lot, and then I think you called it the blight block, and right. Entirely possible that middle property on the blight block, has a predator there, and they're intentionally keeping that block impressed, and I mean intentionally. I mean, it's not by happenstance. It is full well intention to do that.
What we call that is they're riding the slope of decline. So the thing that undermines their business model is rising property values. And so if they can keep the property values stagnant or declining, they can ride that slope of decline down and basically suck the remaining wealth out of it at very low risk. There's two things that are wrapped up in this question that I think are important to tease out. The first one is just the capital flows that we see. Chapter 5 of my book gets a lot into macroeconomics, and when you start talking about this, you can kind of sound a little crazy, because the idea of, like, in the last 2 months, the Federal Reserve printing $5 trillion and using it to buy the debt of insolvent companies so that they can stay afloat, literally giving billions of dollars to existing millionaires and billionaires so that their failed businesses don't go away, so that the economy doesn't crash, et cetera, sounds like the thing of conspiracies. And it's really hard to get your mind around how, like, the local restaurant is not allowed to open, but the Cheesecake Factory, which is, I wrote a big article about them just because it's an obsession of mine, how poorly run and insolvent they are as an entity. I mean, like, literally massive amounts of debt, buying back their own shares, are given huge subsidies in order to stay in business. Do we need the Cheesecake Factory in this country? If the Cheesecake Factory went away, would we not be okay as a nation? Apparently not. And so the Cheesecake Factory, we are all, in a sense, subsidizing with our monetary policy. This insanity going on has created, let me give you two ways of looking at it, has created huge amounts of disorder and dislocation and anxiety and instability at the local level because of the capital flows. If you flip it around and look at it from a Wall Street or a Treasury Department or a top-down position, it's created a lot of investment opportunities in places that otherwise wouldn't get this great capital. And so what you have is it as a viable business model for people to tap into what, in a sense, is cheap money, come in and completely distort your local market in ways that you're calling predatory. The market would call opportunistic, as making the best use of capital. I would agree it tends to be more predatory than anything else. I am a market-oriented person. I believe in markets. I believe that markets help us and tell us things that we need to know. I believe that good systems are largely market-based systems. Let me put a caveat on that. I think for our cities, we need to look at markets as being our community and maybe like the region directly around it. But the idea that our place can function in an international market, one driven by actors that really, have a completely distorted view of who we are and what's going on, I think is not the kind of market that I would envision. So I actually call in chapter 5 for cities to protect their markets. I don't think we should prop up one hardware store over another. But the idea that we should allow systems where, outside capital comes in, freezes our property markets in a way that doesn't allow wealth to be built locally, doesn't allow our people to prosper, and ultimately sucks wealth out of the community is really, really harmful. And if we want to call that a market intervention, if you want to call that socialism, go ahead and yell at me. But I am very much for markets, but I think that we need to protect our local marketplace first, and then build markets off of that, as opposed to have our local markets be derivations of national markets. That being said, our cities right now are dependent on elevated property values, elevated land values, these investment flows. They're dependent on that for their tax receipts. They're dependent on that to make next year's budget. And in that sense, our community is dependent on it. So there's a little bit of a tension that we all have internally, because if we take that capital away, if we protect our cities from that capital, what you're talking about is much lower property values, much different marketplace, a much, much different ecosystem. I think that would be a healthier ecosystem. I think we'd be better off, but it would not be an ecosystem without some huge transaction costs for us as property owners, us as members of a community. the way in the short term we start to deal with this, and I say short term because I think that though that whole system is unstable, and I do think that we are, again, this is where you start to sound like a conspiracy nut, but I think the imbalances in our macro economy are so overwhelming that they will have to be worked out at some point, and it feels like that sometime is becoming sooner and sooner and sooner. The way that would be worked out is broad defaults, huge market corrections, large amounts of inflation, or some combination of those things. These are not, atypical events historically. They happen. They've not happened here for this great moderate period of time we've had post-World War II. The idea that we would go another 20 years without some event like that happening seems rather silly. I think it will happen. In the meantime, the way you start to deal with this at the local level is you have to destroy that business model. And the way you destroy that business model, and this is the second part of what I want to say, is you have to start land values going up. And not going up in relation to other, like not going up as part of a general inflation, but going up specifically on a site. If we can start, remember back to that old pop-up shack block I showed you. The reason why that redeveloped and didn't just stay pop-up shacks was because the underlying land, not the building itself, the buildings were just shacks. They were not worth that much. They maybe were falling apart or what have you. The reason that redeveloped is because the land became more valuable. How does land become more valuable? It's because that actual location becomes more desirable. There's more stuff there. There's more people there. There's more things there. If you think of this, it's the opposite of automobile style development. In automobile style development, everything within a mile of this place is valuable. Everything within 2 miles or 5 miles, because you can get wherever you want. What we're talking about here is taking a neighborhood, in a sense, making it a real neighborhood where the value of that neighborhood is not in your capacity to drive there from 10 miles away to eat at their nice restaurant or what have you. The value of that neighborhood is actually part of living in that neighborhood and investing in that neighborhood and being there. And if we do that, the underlying land value actually starts to go up, and the property becomes not a viable investment just sitting there, just being stagnant. And so let me summarize this by saying placemaking, building an actual place and making that place in itself a better place to be, is the way you destroy that predatory business model, short of some cataclysmic change that's going to affect capital flows in a broader marketplace. We could do 2 hours on that topic. And if you go back, since March, I've been writing a lot about economics and about how it affects our cities. And if you just, go to our website and look at my personal backlog of stuff I've written in the last 3 months, you're going to find an overwhelming. I wrote a whole series 1 week about this, and you'll find hours and hours and hours of dull and boring reading, I'm sure, but stuff that will get into this deeply. So thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. And thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. This Q&A session has been packed full of stuff, so I appreciate that.